Thank you very much for taking out time and joining in today's session. Today's session is an introduction to Microsoft Azure Identity Solutions. It's an introduction to Azure security solutions as well in some ways. And we'll go through a basic overview of what are the options with respect to identity security. What are the options do we have for identity security in Azure? What are the main components and how we can have a good security or a secure infrastructure around our identities? That's what we'll be covering as part of today's session. Before I get started, I just wanted to know if everybody is able to hear me clearly. If you're not able to hear me clearly, please do use the chat or the Q&A and let me know. Throughout the session, if you have any questions, please use the chat and the Q&A to let me know, and I'll be more than happy to review the questions during the course and hopefully answer all of them. So a quick introduction about myself. My name is Roshan. I work with Ingram Micro as a solution architect. I'm based in Melbourne, and I've been working on Azure for the last 8 to 9 years now. I started my career with SharePoint as the Microsoft technology, then moved to Office 365. And my first introduction to Azure was actually deploying SQL and SQL Server and Windows virtual machines for integration with Office 365 and for SharePoint deployments. That's where my journey started with SharePoint. I'm sorry, that's where my journey started with Azure, and I've been primarily focused on infrastructure as a service side of Azure. That includes security as well. Apart from Azure, I also work on Microsoft 365, AWS, a couple of backup and disaster recovery tools like Veeam, Acronis, and I've slowly started getting into security landscape as well. So looking at products like Sophos as well. I've worked with Microsoft for about 5 years. I've worked with other MSPs, Gold Certified Partners for about 4 years. And now I've been working with Ingram Micro for another 4 years now. So that's my overall journey. So in today's session, we'll look at why is identity security important, right? What are the changes that we see in the IT landscape, and why is that identity is now becoming the focal point of security? We'll look into the introduction of Azure Active Directory. I'm sure everybody knows what Active Directory is. Active Directory technology was introduced by Microsoft when they introduced the Windows NT concept, and it's a software, or it's a tool that will help you manage users and groups, policies, devices, all these things. And the same version of the Windows Active Directory in Azure is called as Azure Active Directory. So we look at what Azure Active Directory has in it. How is it different than an Active Directory running on a Windows machine, like an on-prem server or in a Windows environment? We also have a very interesting concept called as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Right? So we look at where do we use this, what's the use case where Azure Active Directory Domain Services make sense, and then we'll jump into, okay, now we know Active Directory. Let's look at how do we provision identity, how do we provision users in Azure Active Directory, what are the options? Next, we'll look at how do we secure these identities once they are provisioned, right? So what are the options that Azure provides in order to go ahead and secure it? There are about 5 buckets of options for securing identity, and we'll look at that. And last but not the least, we'll look at identity score. Now that you have implemented some of the strategies, some of the cybersecurity practices around identity, you would like to know how secure is your identity, right? Are you 100% secure? Are you 30% secure? So that's what a secure score gives. And for a lot of MSPs, secure score acts as a way where they can improve the security offerings that they provide to a customer. They can also use this as part of their managed services offering, where they can improve the secure score stage by stage. So as part of the basic offering, you can say the security score we'll give you is 50%. As part of intermediate, it'll be let's say 70%, and as part of advanced managed services offering, we'll give you at 95%. Right. So that's something that I've seen a lot of MSPs doing, and you will definitely have a sneak peek into the identity score as well. Like I said, throughout the course, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Or if you'd like to ask the questions towards the end, I have a dedicated section for Q&A. We can definitely take up questions at the end as well. So let's get started. Evolution of security. Now, like IT infrastructure or IT in general, it began with physical servers. So we had IBM servers, that mainframe servers that came into existence in 1800s, 1700s, and people started using these servers to run their applications, right? So the security was always around protecting your physical servers, right? So that there is no, let's say, water damage, or there is no electrical damage to your physical servers itself. As IT evolved, the security then slowly started getting converted into network. We have companies now using virtualization. We have companies using client server architecture for their applications. And since they are spread across multiple locations and all the locations are connected using a network security became the next big component in order to secure it. You'd not wanted any third-party person to sniff through your network and get to know the details of your communication, right? Network security became very important. It is still important, but that is how the transition started happening. The last is identity, right? In the 21st century, we have users using mobile devices, tablets, Windows, Mac. They access the systems from home, from office, from guest locations. The common feature or the common parameter across all these various logins is identity, right? The username and password. That is common whether they use company provided device, whether they use their own device, or if they use an internet cafe to check for their emails, for example. The username and password is the most important identity or the most important parameter that correctly identifies who the user is, and based on that, he's given either read-write permission or he's given access to certain resources. So keeping this in mind, why do we now need identity security? So this is a quick animation where I just wanted to show how the threats can get transferred from one location to another location, and having identity security is very, very essential. Like we all know, network security definitely provides protection against classic threats, DDoS protection, your unauthorized access. It acts as a barrier between, let's say, the internet and intranet. So these are typical network protections that we see, and these are protected. These still do protect against classic attacks, but nowadays the attacks are becoming more advanced. For example, phishing attacks, right? So these are emails being sent which look very, very legitimate, and there are times that these emails get opened by end users, and once they click on that, then the data of that particular user is tracked, and that user not only is accessing on-prem systems, he's accessing cloud systems, he's accessing branch location servers, he's accessing he's using the same account to access, let's say, his personal IDs. So the only barrier now for protection is your identity parameter, right? Because this is one parameter that goes across all the different sources where your data is stored, whether it is in cloud, within your perimeter network, within your network in internal network, or whether it is part of your unmanaged devices. So it's very, very critical and important to make sure that you have identity security at the core. Today, network protection or just having a firewall is not considered as secure. You need to make sure that you educate your customers about various attacks like phishing attacks. They know which emails are legitimate, which emails are not. You also have a clear IT governance around which devices should they use in order to access corporate data. You need to define what ports and protocols are allowed, even at an application level, for them to access. So all this keeping in mind, identities become the most important parameter. And following up with that, identities of power users are more and more important, right? So making sure you do not use the admin account to do every activity within the organization. We have come across customers where they use the domain admin account not only as the PC's local administrator, but the same account is also used as a SQL admin. It's also used as application admin. It's also used as remote desktop support agents. So having the same account being used in multiple locations, and if that account has privileged access, hackers and attackers are always looking for such accounts. So making sure each account has access to only things that they require and have limited access. We look into Azure how it provides these various features and functionalities of limiting and restricting access. So identity and access management with Azure Active Directory. Like I said, Windows Active Directory was something Microsoft introduced many, many years ago. And when Microsoft came out with the cloud offering, they transitioned or evolved that Windows Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. It still provides a lot of basic functionalities which Windows Active Directory provides, like user management, password management, group management. It is actually the backend for your Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365. It can integrate with most of the popular software as a service applications that require some kind of authentication, right? In the last several years, Azure Active Directory is also now evolved where it can now integrate with your on-prem Active Directory. You can extend it. You can have machines joined to Azure Active Directory domain services. So those are a lot of enhancements that Microsoft has done, and now Azure Active Directory is possibly the most important and the most used feature in the entire Microsoft cloud ecosystem. So a quick insight into Azure Active Directory. It's the Microsoft multi-tenant directory infrastructure. So it is one big Azure Active Directory, which is used by thousands and thousands of customers, right? It has all your identity management options. Like I said earlier, you can define roles, you can define groups, you can assign permissions to the groups, you can assign different roles to the users so that they have only limited access or the right access. It can also integrate with your on-premise Active Directory. This has probably been the most used scenario where I would say 90% of the customers have an on-prem Active Directory, which they are currently using for their, let's say, remote desktop services or for Exchange server, or for any other application that uses Active Directory for authentication. And they would like to continue to use the same, let's say, the same user and password information on to Azure Active Directory, and that is very much possible. 90% of the customers actually go ahead and integrate or sync their on-premise Windows Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. There is a tool available called Azure AD Connect, which customers use in order to sync your on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. And by syncing your on-prem to Azure Active Directory, users get a single sign-on experience. For example, if you use Dropbox or Salesforce, for example, Salesforce is a software as a service CRM tool, which can integrate with Azure AD for authentication. So once you log into Azure AD, and when you click on, let's say, the Salesforce icon, you're not prompted for username and password again. So that's how you can provide single sign-on. So what's the difference between Azure AD and Windows AD? Right, one of the biggest differences is Azure AD uses SAML or OAuth-based authentication. Active Directory uses Kerberos-based authentication or NTLM, right? That's one of the biggest differences. Azure Active Directory is a very flat directory services, which means you cannot really create OUs and multiple nested OUs within Azure AD, like how you can create it in an on-prem Active Directory, right? Also, if you have an application, not a software as a service, if you have, let's say, a CRM tool that uses Windows Active Directory and it actually uses Kerberos authentication or LDAP authentication to authenticate with on-prem Windows Active Directory. And if you want the same application to work with Azure AD, it will not work because Azure AD does not understand LDAP. It only understands OAuth and SAML, right? So in simple terms, Azure AD is more suited for software as a service applications. On-prem Windows Active Directory can be used with both software as a service and for traditional applications that understand LDAP protocol. Okay. Let's see if there's a question. So there's a question from Sean saying, do you need an on-prem domain controller for MFA on machine login with Azure AD? The answer is no, you don't need it. In the upcoming slides, I'll talk about how you can implement multi-factor authentication. But is having an on-prem DC a requirement for having multi-factor authentication? The answer is no, that's not a prerequisite. So a couple of quick questions that I always receive. Can I join a Windows 10 machine to Azure AD? Right? The answer is both yes and no, but I will start with no, unless you have Azure AD domain services. So Microsoft has recently introduced something called as a hybrid join, in which you can actually go ahead and join a Windows 10 machine to Azure AD. But when you say hybrid join, it's not actually similar to how you join a machine and on an on-prem laptop to your domain, right? So if you would like to have that similar experience of joining your Windows machine to a domain, then you have to enable an additional feature called as domain services. It's a feature on top of Azure AD. The next one, can I create and manage group policies in Azure AD? This is another frequently asked questions that I get. Can you do that in Azure AD? The answer is no. You cannot create or manage group policies in Azure AD unless you enable Azure AD domain services. So what is Azure AD domain services? In the previous slide, we saw how Azure AD uses SAML and OAuth based authentication, right? Now, if you want to convert Azure AD from SAML or OAuth into making it understand LDAP based authentication, that is where you enable this feature known as domain services. So domain services basically converts your Azure AD into Windows AD or a very similar to Windows AD, like an on-prem Active Directory itself, right? So once you do that, then you can join Windows 10, Windows Server. You can have applications which currently work with LDAP authentication with your Windows Active Directory, it can now start working with Azure Active Directory as well, right? So the way it would work is your on-prem Active Directory can sync with Azure AD, and then you enable domain services, and then it can start working with all your infrastructure as a service components like your servers, virtual machines, and things like this. Now, a quick update. If you have a customer who do not have an, who do not or does not use an on-prem Active Directory, has users directly created in Azure AD, and has some applications that do not work with Azure AD authentication. It needs domain services. Can it be done? Answer is yes. You can enable domain services on Azure Active Directory, even though you do not have an on-prem Active Directory. So always remember, Azure AD and Azure AD domain services has no prerequisite saying that you should have an on-prem Active Directory, right? But what we have seen is most of the customers tend to have an on-prem Active Directory, right? For their printer management, for users and group management, for application authentication and things like this. So this is a quick question, and I would like people to participate in the chat and let me know. Is Azure AD Domain Services included in Azure AD Plan 1 or Plan 2? So you can just use the chat and let me know if you think it's included in Plan 1. You can say Plan 1 or P1, or you can say P2. I'd appreciate if people can participate in the chat and let me know, what do you think? Does it include in P1, P2? Okay, I see some of the folks saying P2. Actually, the answer is none. It's not included in any of the plans. It needs to be purchased separately, right? So it's an add-on which is not part of your P1 or P2 plan, right? Now Azure AD has many plans. It has a free plan, which is part of your Office 365, Microsoft 365. It has a P1 plan, which has some additional features, and P2 plan. So in the upcoming slides, I'll show you what's included in P1, what's included in P2. So P1 and P2, if you need greater security around your identities, you actually use P1 or P2. But Azure AD also has a free plan. So that's about Azure AD and why we require identity security. Now let's look at how do you provision an identity? How do you create a user account? Now, there are two ways to create a user account in Azure AD. One is you can have a cloud-only user, which means, let's say you have a company named Contoso, which is a very small company, a 10-user company. They are into media and advertisement. They have 10 laptops. They are spread across multiple locations, and they don't really have a physical office. They're all sitting, working from home. They meet up in cafes and work together. So this company does not really require an on-prem Active Directory. Now, let's say this company wants to move some of its applications to Office 365. Let's say they want to start using Office 365, Microsoft 365 for email and SharePoint. So this company, you can directly go ahead and create the users, 10 user accounts on Azure AD, right? They do not need to have any on-prem Active Directory. The second option, let's say another company called, let's say Fabricam. It has, let's say another 50 users. Let's say it has 50 user company. They have a couple of servers. They have an ERP solution which runs on-prem. And they have users in multiple locations. Everybody uses Windows 10. They also have a HR system. So it's a company that has a couple of servers. They use Active Directory, and now they want to move to the servers to Azure. They want to move to Office 365, Microsoft 365. Now in this scenario, what we do is, instead of creating the users again, we go ahead and sync their on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. And these users are known as hybrid IDs, hybrid identities or hybrid user accounts. Right? Now, creating the user account straight in Azure is pretty simple. You give them first name, last name, display name, email address, give them a password, add them into a role, and it's done. When it is from on-prem to Azure, you need to have a tool that actually goes ahead and syncs or replicates your on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. And that is where Microsoft has this tool called as Azure AD Connect. It's a free tool. In simple English, think of it as a replication tool that replicates your on-prem Active Directory information, right? Your groups, your OUs, your groups, your users, your permissions, the role assignments, sorry, not permissions, the role assignments, all of those get migrated to Azure AD. Okay, so once it is in Azure AD, now they can use that same username and password to go ahead and log into any application that works with Azure AD. Right? And if you have domain services configured on Azure AD, which means now they can log into any applications that not only use Azure AD, but also can authenticate to domain services on an LDAP protocol. Right? So that is how you can extend your on-prem Active Directory to Azure AD and then to domain services. Now, in order to synchronize users to Azure AD, there are multiple options. So there are overall there are three options. Option one is password hash synchronization. So here, what happens is your username and password, especially the password, is hashed, is encrypted, and then sent to Azure AD. Right? And is your hashed password is stored in Azure AD. That is how the synchronization or the replication happens. In pass-through authentication, which is the second option, your password never leaves your Active Directory. Right? It is always stored within your on-premise Active Directory itself. Only your username information is sent to Azure AD. So in second option, how does the authentication happen? So if you have implemented pass-through authentication, then every time a user logs in, his login information is sent to your on-prem Active Directory. It checks whether the logged in information is correct. It verifies the password in your on-prem Active Directory, sends back a token. Once the token is verified, the user logs in. Right? In the first method, since the username and password is synchronized with Azure AD, as soon as the user logs in, the authentication happens directly in Azure AD. In the second method, the verification of the password happens in your on-premise Active Directory. So there are a couple of extra components. You actually go ahead and install an agent on your on-prem Active Directory in the second method, which is pass-through authentication, in order for it to facilitate the password verification process. The last one is implementing Active Directory Federation service. Now, it's becoming more and more rare that people are now implementing Active Directory Federation services. One of the common use case that I've seen is if a customer is using, let's say, Windows Active Directory and Sun Microsystems Active Directory or Novell Active Directory, and now they want single sign-on between both these different authentication providers. That is when you use ADFS. Or if you need a seamless single sign-on experience between multiple authentication providers, that is where you use ADFS. Right? It's in very large customer base where they have very stringent single sign-on policies. They have multiple authentication providers. They have users using, let's say, IBM authentication. They're using Linux-based authentication, Windows-based authentication, and they want to have a single sign-on across all this. That's where you use ADFS. ADFS is a Windows role which works on claims-based authentication. So this is a quick decision tree. I'll be sharing the slides after the session. So when you are deciding which authentication provider or which authentication option should I use, you can use the decision tree. I would always recommend you to use password hash sync with most of your customers, or with customers where it is possible, because with password hashing, there are additional security benefits that you will see in the upcoming slides, which you may not get with pass-through authentication or with ADFS. So let me pause here for a minute and know if anybody has any questions. If you do have any questions, please use the chat or the Q&A. Okay, so there are no questions coming up, so I'll proceed. So we looked at why is identity security important, what is Azure Active Directory, what is Azure Active Directory domain services. We looked at how do you provision an Active Directory, how do you provision identity. The most important piece of today's session is how do you secure the created identity. So there are 5 buckets of how you can use or the options available within Azure for you to protect your username and password, or to protect your identity. Right? One is to strengthen your credential, making sure you have enough ammunitions to protect your username and password. You make sure that users are entering the right username and password, the password is not leaked, so things like this. Second is reduce your surface attack area. So you want to make sure that there is no intentional or unintentional leakage of your username and password, right? How do you make sure there is less and less possibilities for an unauthorized access via your username and password? Automate threat response. So even if your account is compromised, how can you quickly respond to that threat and, let's say, reset the password or remove the permissions? Fourth one is utilizing cloud intelligence. Now, since as an MSP, you will have several customers, right? And each customer might have different way they reset their password, or different ways they create users. Some might be directly Azure AD, some might be syncing. You need to have a reporting or some kind of an overall idea of which customers have certain security implemented, which customers do not have. Is there an issue happening anywhere? So you need to have that intelligence, cloud-based reporting or cloud-based intelligence, in order to find out if there is a potential threat in any of your customers' environment. And last but not the least, try to move to as much as self-service options, where users can themselves fix the issue rather than contacting the IT support or MSP for every single thing. So let's look at the first one, strengthen your credentials. So what are the options? The first one and the most important one is implement multi-factor authentication, right? 80% of cybersecurity attacks can be reduced by just implementing multi-factor authentication, right? So what is multi-factor authentication? Multi-factor means having another factor apart from your password in order to identify the user, right? So that second factor can be an SMS sent to your phone, a phone call, a code sent to another email address to which you have access to, right? Or an iris scan, your eye scan, or your fingerprint scan. All these things contribute to a second factor authentication. So you can have not just 2, you can even have multiple multi-factors, right? So you can have multiple factors considered in order to authenticate that user, in order to make sure it is the legitimate user who's logging in to access resources. Azure AD also has a feature called as Azure AD Dynamic Band Password. Once this feature is enabled, it will make sure that when a user resets his password, he does not use a password that is easily guessed. For example, let's say the password that the user had previously set was spring 2021 exclamation, right? When he resets the password, he should not use spring 2022 exclamation, right? That is what dynamic band password looks at. It's a sort of say intelligence, artificial intelligence that makes sure that the password users are setting are not easily guessed. And if they try to set it, it'll give an error saying this cannot be used. Okay. The next one is protect against credential leak. Now, Azure AD has certain functionality, especially in Premier Plan 2 or Azure AD Plan 2, where you can get information about what your if your credentials were leaked, right? It signifies if a user is at a risk level, and you're able to identify that user and stop him from either accessing the applications or asking him to reset his password, right? So you have both the options. Once you identify a user who is a risky user, you can either block his access, you can either ask him for multi-factor, or you can ask him to reset his password. So these are ways of how you can protect against a credential leak. I'm sorry, that's not lead, that should be leak, L-E-A-K, sorry. So you can protect against credential leak using the identity protection feature, which is part of your Azure AD. Last but not the least is going passwordless. Azure now has the functionality where you can implement Windows Hello, where using the camera on the laptop, it is able to scan your face and log in without even prompting for password, right? Passwordless can also be a fingerprint scanner, right? So as soon as you put your username, it'll not even ask for password. You just scan your thumb and it'll log you in. So it is very critical that you slowly start transitioning customers into a passwordless environment, because as much as your customers move to passwordless, it becomes very difficult for hackers to hack into their accounts and use it for malicious activities, right? So these are 4 methods of how you can strengthen your credentials. Let's go to the next bucket, which is reduce surface attack. Now, again, within Azure AD Plan 1 and Plan 2, you have additional features, especially in Plan 2, you have a feature known as Azure AD Conditional Access. So like the name says, you are able to access a resource based on a condition. For example, you can define a condition that every user who's accessing emails on web, which is on Outlook Web Access, should access it using a corporate device or using a device provided by the company. So you put a condition saying the device has to be corporate, and only if the device is corporate, then he can access the emails on the web, right? That is conditional access. You can have several conditional accesses created. You can also have conditions where they say that I'm hosting my application on Azure, and if users want to access this application from their home, then they should have a VPN connection to Azure, right? So these are conditions that you can create within Azure AD, and this will reduce the surface attack because you are specifying how they should access, what are the conditions they should meet in order to access these applications. The second one is user consent operation. Now, when we use applications in the cloud, there are a lot of other companies that provide cloud apps, right, which can be used as plugins to improve your productivity, to, let's say, get better reporting of user activity or email activity and things like this. Now, a lot of time, what happens is users start, installing or accepting uh, applications which are there in the marketplace and start using it to connect to their corporate data. So for example, if you want to integrate your Office 365 calendars, and if you want to share your calendar with the external world, there are several apps that are available over the internet, right? A lot of times users do not go through the terms and conditions. They don't read the what information they actually access when you give them permission, and they go ahead and consent for the third-party application to use their data. Now, this is problematic because these third-party applications, if they're not reputed, they might use your data for advertisement. They might use your data to get more information about you, your organization, and then later exploit it when they are trying to attack or hack into your network. So it's very important that you have restrictions around who can consent in order to, let's say, work with another third-party application, right? So reducing the permission. By default, within Azure AD, all the users have the ability to consent for applications. So it's very important that when you set up an Azure AD for an organization, for your customer, you actually go ahead and disable this particular setting and have it enabled either for a group of users or have it enabled for your account as an MSP, so that you can go ahead and consent on their behalf and provide them with whatever applications they need. The last but not the least is privileged identity management, known as PIM, and privileged access management, known as PAM. These are possibly the two biggest security strategies that a lot of enterprise companies are now implementing, right? Having protection around your power users or privileged identities is one of the most important cybersecurity strategies, because whenever a company is attacked, the first account the attacker goes after is an admin account, right? The account which gives him more permissions, more, I would say, access to all the resources within the company. That's the account that the attacker is always trying to get, right? So having protection around privileged identity, making sure users only get privileged identity for a certain time to do a specific activity, right? For example, if you have a user, let's say a database administrator, who wants to log into the database to do some maintenance, let's say to back up some databases, right? You have to provide him the privilege of becoming a SQL administrator for, let's say, a couple of days, and for him to do specific activities only in that 8 hours or in that 2 days, right? That is what is privileged identity management. And within Azure AD, especially Azure AD Plan 2, you have the option to implement privileged identity management. So you can promote the user from a normal user to become a global administrator, or to become a contributor, or to become a VM virtual machine contributor only for a specific amount of time. And after they have completed, or after that specific amount of time, they are again demoted back to a simple user, right? In this way, even if an attacker gains unauthorized access to the environment, he will not be able to automatically promote himself to global administrator. And even within the customer's environment, you're trying to make sure that there are no unauthorized people having administrator access for, let's say, infinite time, right, for all the time. Next one is automate threat response. This is again part of Azure AD Plan 2. It's part of identity protection, Azure AD identity protection. So earlier, like I said in the first section where I was speaking about strengthening your credential, one of the options we spoke about is reducing or getting the information of a credential leak, right? So within Azure AD Plan 2, there is a feature called as Azure AD Identity Protection, which is an artificial intelligence based, let's say, tool or a process that checks if a user is risky or if a sign-in is risky. For example, how does it classify a sign-in as a risky? Let's say if the user today signed in from let's say Australia, and within 5 minutes he logged in from let's say Russia, right? So this is flagged as a user risk and a sign-in risk, right? Or if the user suddenly logged in from a device which he typically doesn't log in from, right? He's logging in from, let's say, a browser which is throwing up anonymous IP address. So these are some of the events which Azure AD is able to track and flag the user as a user risk or his sign-in as a sign-in risk. And based on a user risk or a sign-in risk, you can attach conditional access. You can say that, okay, if a sign-in risk is qualified as high risk, then make sure that the user, when he logs in the next time, resets his password or is prompted for multi-factor authentication or is blocked, his access is blocked, right? So you can define these conditional access in conjunction with the risk security, the risk policies that you define, right? It gives a very strong security this implements a very strong security infrastructure, because as soon as Azure AD detects there's something wrong, you have conditions in place which will double check or triple check whether it's the right user or if it's a user who is not supposed to be having the access to your username and password. Next one is utilizing cloud intelligence. So again, the same feature, which is Azure AD Identity Protection, gives you these in-depth information. Which users are risky, which users are not, which users have done certain events or are part of events like accessing from multiple locations, accessing from anonymous devices or non-registered devices, accessing from devices which are not registered or compliant with your rules and regulations. So it gives you detailed reporting of all the users and sign-ins that they have done. Azure Sentinel is another beautiful tool that Microsoft has, which can take all the data of your Azure AD. It can take sign-in data, user activity data, user login data, application access data, all this data, and you can have your own dashboards created based on the data that Azure Sentinel is able to collect, right? And the best part is data from Azure AD into Azure Sentinel is free of cost. There's no charge associated with it. So for example, if you want to know which users across all your customers do not have multi-factor enabled, right? Or which users uh, 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 requested for global administrator several times within an hour, or randomly started requesting higher permissions. So these are things that you can identify from Sentinel, and it's a real-time analytics. It's not scheduled. You can definitely have jobs scheduled, but one of the beauties of Sentinel is it is able to provide this data in real time. Last but not the least, have self-service options available for your users. So one of the best options is self-service password reset. So if a user forgets his password, he doesn't have to wait for the IT to get back to him or raise a ticket. He can quickly log into a site, reset his password. Self-service group management is also a good feature where as soon as the user gets created, based on his, let's say, department or based on his location or based on his designation, he automatically becomes part of certain groups which have certain restrictions, certain access, right? Self-service group management is also very important. Azure Active Directory entitle management is a very interesting feature. For example, let's say if you have, if you're a customer uh, who uses Salesforce, who uses Dropbox, who uses Microsoft 365. Now, if you want, when a user gets created, as soon as the user gets created based on certain properties, he should be part of one group which has certain permissions in Salesforce. He should be part of another group which has certain permissions on Dropbox. He should be part of, let's say, a readers group which has certain permissions on SharePoint, right? So if you want such such permissions assigned to that user, then you use entitle management, right? Last but not the least is Azure AD Access Review. For example, let's say for a user you have given contribute permissions on your entire Azure subscription, right? Now, after a month, you want to verify whether this user still requires contribute permission. So contribute means read and write permission across your entire Azure subscription, right? You want to check whether the user actually requires this after a month, right? So you can initiate an access review where the user is notified, and if he needs, he has to provide a justification. So you can put all these as part of your review. He needs to provide justification. You request him to reset his password or confirm his multi-factor again. And only after these steps, he can go ahead and continue to have that permission. In case he doesn't respond back, let's say that user has now moved on to another department, and let's say the user doesn't reply or doesn't respond or doesn't need, then automatically that permission will be revoked, right? This access review is not just for Active Directory roles, it can even be for privileged roles as well. So let's say if you have added certain users into global admin group, right? So because they were doing let's say a project, or they were doing a migration and they were part of it, but let's say that work is completed and you want to check whether they still require it, you can again raise access review, and that will go ahead and check if, or initiate a request to the user asking, do you still need it? If yes, please provide a justification. Please reset your password, or please confirm your credential using multi-factor. And if he doesn't comply with any of this, then his permission will be automatically removed. So these are 5 buckets of permission management that you can have with identity. So if you implement multi-factor, if you implement Azure AD Plan 2, where you get conditional access, where you get identity protection, where you get privileged access management. And if you implement these various tools and technology, then you can definitely be much more secure against cybersecurity threats. So last, let's say we implemented some of them and you want to know what is that you're missing, or how secure is your identity. That is where Secure Score comes in. So Secure Score is a score or an indication based on Microsoft's best practices around security, around identity security. So the score considers several things. It considers what you have implemented, and with respect to what you're using and how your identity is being used. It also gives you suggestions to improve your identity, and it gives you an overall score of it. So this is a quick snapshot, right? And it is given for each and every user. right? It's not just for an entire organization as a whole. You get this for each and every user, and based on that, you can take suitable actions. And this is something that you can use as part of your managed services as well. Well, that pretty much brings me to the end of today's session. Just wanted to quickly check if there are any questions. Will you be emailing the link to the recording? Answer is yes. So you will get an email from our marketing team. Either they'll send it after each session or after all the 3 sessions, which are part of the series. You'll receive one email with a link of all the 3 sessions and the slides for it. So I think we have run over time. So if you do not have any questions, this pretty much brings me to the end of today's session. My contact details are mentioned on the slide. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email and I'll be more than happy to get in touch with you and answer any of your questions. There's another question here saying, does the on-prem Active Directory force password change on the next login, sync to Azure AD, and work with self-service reset? So your questions are twofold. The first one is, does Azure AD force password change on the next login once you sync to Azure AD? The answer is no, it doesn't force users to change the password. But if you want them to change, this is something that can be enabled. Okay. The second piece is, does it work with self-service password reset? Yes, it does work with self-service password reset. So let's say if you have done a sync, an on-prem to Active Directory sync, there is an option when you're configuring it to tick a checkbox saying password write back. So if they change the password in Azure AD, it will write back to your on-prem Active Directory as well. So Molish, I hope that answers your question. Okay, great. So thank you all for taking out time and joining me in today's session. I hope the session was helpful and informative. The next session is on the next Tuesday. It's on Windows Virtual Desktop, a very interesting topic. So if you're interested in learning about Virtual Desktop, do join us in that session. And like always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me in today's session, and have a great day ahead. I will be on the chat for the next 5 to 10 minutes if you have any questions. Thank you.